Hello, Miss C again. We are finally at the end of Macbeth. So we've got one more act to go. I want to get through it today, and I am recording this quite late at night, hence the weird lighting. So apologies in advance if this looks or sounds a little bit different. You've probably guessed by now that I'm not the most professional in the world, but we try, don't we? So we are now going to finally see, hopefully, Macbeth meet his maker. Macbeth finally pay for the terrible things he's done. And we are going to see the final downfall of this tragic hero. Okay, so we left Act 4, which was, as I said, 3 very long scenes, just 3. And they were in very different scenarios. We were in England, we were with the witches, we were seeing Lady Macduff be murdered. Act 5 is very different because what Act 5 does is it brings everything together by having these quite short, almost, I think I've mentioned before, but almost like if you're watching a film, it would be like the sort of final climactic moment. So lots of cross-cutting between the baddies and the goodies, and it's like the action scene. So we've got 8 scenes in this act. And the first scene is probably one of the most famous of all in this play, and that is Lady Macbeth's sort of sleepwalking scene, okay? And in this scene, we see a very different Lady Macbeth to the one that we sort of left. Now, we could argue that we were seeing that she had a side to her that was weaker because she needed the help to be evil, because when she was on her own, she was talking about her fears. But what we've now got is a Lady Macbeth that's completely lost it, right? She is not able to speak normally. Previously in the play, she spoke usually in blank verse, which means it's sort of rhythmic, poetic verse, but without rhyme. But she did have an order to how she spoke. We get to this point and she's just speaking in prose, in normal language. She's just speaking. She's erratic. She's jumping around from past to present. Okay, but we'll get onto that as we sort of go through the scene. So first thing to think about is that when we come into Act 5, we are in a room in the castle, and there is a doctor, and there is, she's called a gentlewoman. Essentially, she's like a lady in waiting for Lady Macbeth. So she's sort of like someone that waits on her, looks after her. I'm also going to apologise right now for the terribly greasy hair. I hadn't really planned to do a video tonight, but I just decided I wanted to get Macbeth done so that we could move on to maybe Jekyll and Hyde, maybe Inspector Calls. Anyway, so there are these 2 characters, and they are talking about the fact that they are there waiting for Lady Macbeth to show up, because the gentlewoman has noticed that over the last however long, she's been sleepwalking. She's been getting up and saying and doing very strange things, and the doctor's there to sort of watch and see how that plays out. So what we see when she finally comes in, I do apologise, I'm looking for something. What we finally see when she actually enters the scene is a woman that is, she's awake, she's asleep, but she's awake. So she's sort of, her eyes are open, but there's no sense there, I think is sort of what the doctor pretty much says. And she starts talking about how there's a spot, there's a spot. And it looks like she can see, she seems to think there's blood on her hand. She seems to think there's something that she can't get off. She's also sort of talking about what we know as the audience, dramatic irony, is that she is sort of reliving the night of the murder of Duncan. She is talking about, you know, get to bed, go. Why would anyone question us when we are going to make ourselves look like we are in so much grief for doing it? Lots of comments that we know as an audience that saw them do it is her harking back to that night. It's kind of suspicious, and the doctor sort of says to the gentlewoman, go to, you have heard and seen what you should not. Because obviously, again, we're looking at a time when we're implicating a king and a queen. They can do bad things to you, yeah? So we don't want to be putting ourselves in a position where we know things, we've got dirt on kings or queens. So they're watching her do this, and they're watching her speak. She's erratic, she's repeating herself. And I always think there's the saddest moment in the play is where she gets to a point where she's going backwards into time and she's repeating herself. And then there's a moment of almost what seems like clarity where she goes, yeah, who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him? And I've always said this is the saddest line in the play for me, because she's talking about Duncan, and she's talking about the fact that when she went back to place the daggers on the guards, because if you remember, Macbeth forgot to leave them there, so she went back. She's having this moment of utter kind of, oh my God, we didn't kill a king. We didn't kill something, you know, it wasn't about us getting power. For that moment, she's just seeing an old man and she's realising that killing someone is bloody and messy and awful. And that moment of clarity before she switches back to her very erratic tours and fros, I think is really, really important. She also spends a while talking about this spot on her hand, which obviously you can draw that parallel quite easily with the blood that Macbeth felt he couldn't remove from his hands early on in the play, you know, all of Neptune's oceans. And she says, back then, when he's feeling so guilty about all that blood, she says, a little water clears off this deed, it's fine. Now, at this point, she can't get the blood off her hands. Obviously, it's not actually there. And she's saying all of the perfumes of Arabia could not sweeten this little hand. Now, there's obviously a lovely hyperbole there, which is talking about how she's never going to be able to sweeten, you know, she's never going to be able to clear herself of this blood. Now, if we think about this motif of blood, blood represents guilt, right? Blood represents the fact that, you know, she's stained by this event, she's stained by this action, and she has to be forever punished for it. The other thing that I think is interesting is, again, she wanted this power. She was, you know, asserting herself over her husband. She was this, she was that. At this point, it's her little hand. She's feminine again. She's fragile again. Yeah, she's vulnerable again. So it's, I can't sweeten this little hand. So it's worth bearing in mind quite how much she's crumbled and fallen by this point. As I said, the doctor is feeling very, very uncomfortable watching this. And he sort of says it's not actually a doctor that this woman needs. She needs God. She needs to be sort of praying and hoping that God can save her, because there ain't nothing I can do anymore. So he kind of doesn't say, I think she's a big fat murderer who's killed the king. But the way he kind of responds to what she's done, you can clearly see that he knows what she's done, and, you know, he doesn't want to say too much, because ultimately, as we know, that is not stuff that you want to be found to know, because obviously if you know that stuff, you could be very much getting yourself in trouble there, couldn't you? Very much so. So we sort of leave this scene now. One other thing actually about this scene that I think is really interesting is the fact that she comes in holding a candle, and the doctor sort of says, well, how did she come by that candle, that taper it's called in the play? And the gentlewoman says, oh, she demands it to be with her all the time, like she wants it with her day and night. And again, if we think about the sort of progression throughout the play of this, early on in the play, she says, come thick night, shroud me in the dunnest smoke of hell. She doesn't want light to sort of let heaven peek through and tell her to stop. So at this point, we again really see this sort of progression in her character. She's now scared of the dark. She now wants light with her. She's now essentially, does this show that it's too little too late? She's turning back to good, but it's too late for her. So we see a very broken Lady Macbeth, a very sad Lady Macbeth, and we then move on. Now, the next few scenes happen. I'm not going to do a big makeup thing today with my eyes or anything, really, I don't think, because we don't have that much time to get through quite a lot of stuff. I'm just going to fiddle around and see what I come up with. But the really sort of interesting thing about this is the next few scenes, we just bat backwards and forwards between various players in this final battle. So everyone is now moving towards Dunsinane. Everyone is moving towards Macbeth's castle, right? And we have the English army that have come, obviously, from England, who King Edward has given to Malcolm to sort of bring back with him. So we know that we've got them. But what we also have is the Scottish army that are also sort of rising up against, I've got no idea what I'm doing. Let's just see what happens here. Who are coming up against Macbeth. So we have the English army, 10,000 of them, and they're sort of on their way to meet the Scottish army. The Scottish army are waiting to meet the English army, and they know that Macbeth is readying himself in his castle for what he knows is coming, which is everybody rising up against him. Because despite the fact that he's a tyrant and people are scared of him, he also knows that people aren't happy about his reign, and there are people that are going to come back and, you know, oh no, what have I done here? Let's just try this then. People that are going to try and sort of overthrow and get rid of him, right? So Act 5, Scene 2, we see the Scottish army. And essentially it's another kind of it's a little bit of exposition. It's a little bit of like, this is what's been going on. This is where everybody is. This is what we're waiting to happen. And so that's what we see. We see them talking about the fact that they're going to be meeting the Scottish Army, the English Army, and Macbeth is sort of readying himself for this battle that he's sure is coming. Now, at this point, we pretty much move straight into the next scene where we see what Macbeth's been up to. Now, Macbeth, I always find this a really interesting sort of character development here, because he reminds me a little bit of, I don't know, if you've ever been worried about something, but you kind of know that you shouldn't be because you've been told everything's fine, and then you keep wanting to get reassurance for it. So you'll sort of keep repeating, yeah, I know, I'm really worried about it, but it's fine because they said this, it's fine, it's, you know, but I know that can't happen because this happened first and this happened first, it'll be fine. And I think we've all been there where we sort of try and convince ourselves that everything's going to be fine, even when potentially things aren't looking great. And I think that's what Macbeth's doing here, because he's been to the witches, he's had those new sort of apparitions come to him and tell him, you know, you'll be fine, no man or woman born can harm you, you'll be fine until the trees get up and move. You know, and, you know, just that beware Macduff. And he's like, look, no man or woman born can harm me. And he essentially comes into the scene repeating that back to himself. Like, obviously, it's bothering him and it's hanging over him. Where is my brush gone? Oh, there it is. And it's clearly bothering him and it's clearly hanging over him. And so he keeps sort of telling himself he's going to be fine. But he's erratic as well, and he's nervous. He's snappy. He's jumpy. And he also learns at this point in this scene from a poor servant who he just has to go out and shouts at and is horrible to, that there is an army coming for him that is from England. And he learns that there are 10,000 men heading his way with Malcolm leading them, all right? And again, he does kind of spout off, yes, but I can't be harmed until this, that and the other. I'll be fine until Birnam Wood gets up and walks. But I always think there's an element here where you can see that he kind of knows things are starting to not look very good, okay? Oh, I don't know what I'm doing, but let's just work with it. So we sort of leave Macbeth there for a minute. Oh, and before that, actually, the doctor comes in to sort of tell him, oh, by the way, your wife's like, you know, really not looking good, Macbeth. And he sort of goes, well, cure her then, fix her. What are you talking about? Just sort her out. And again, the doctor says, I don't think it's me that can really help her. And Macbeth is in his proper sort of tyrant, angry, irrational phase. And so he's just like, I will throw physic to the dog then, you know, basically throw medicine to the dogs. If you can't fix her, like, what is the point of you? And you could argue he's kind of losing sight. I mean, he's already lost sight of a lot of things, but you could argue that he seems to have lost sight here of what's important. The wife that was his partner in greatness, he now seems a little bit more just like, oh, just fix her, get it sorted. It's, you know, I'm busy. And in fairness, you know, he's busy having lots of people wanting to come and murder him. So, you know, I understand, I guess. Maybe wifey's got to wait a minute. So, we leave that scene knowing that Lady Macbeth's in trouble, all right? She's not well. Macbeth's doing very little to kind of try and fix that or sort it out. But we also know that his kind of people are closing in on him, and it starts to feel a little bit more claustrophobic. It starts to feel a little bit like, okay, things are closing in now. So after that, we go back to outside the castle, okay? But this time we're with the English army who we haven't seen them yet. And they are sort of quite nearby, looking at how they're going to get closer to Macbeth's castle without sort of being spotted, I suppose. And what they decide to do is camouflage themselves with branches from the trees, and they are currently in Birnam Wood. So, of course, I'm assuming everybody knew this anyway, but clever them, they think, well, we can make our way closer if we're camouflaged with the trees. Now, obviously, the witches at this point, the audience are going to go, oh my God, those wily witches. Because what essentially they've done is they've told a half-truth. Because actually Macbeth is safe until the woods get up and move, but it's not the trees getting up and moving. It's obviously the men camouflage with the tree branches. And so there's a dramatic irony here, because before Macbeth works out what's going on, we know now what's going on with that. We now know that prophecy came true. And it's kind of the reverse of when it's like, well, at the beginning you were told you'd be Thane of you were told you're Thane of Glamis, you were told you're going to be Thane of Cawdor, and then you were told you're going to be king. When 2 out of those 3 things come true, things ain't looking good, are they? Now at the moment, only 1 of those things have come true, because he was told, beware Macduff, and no man or woman born can harm you, as well as being told that he was safe until the woods move. So at the moment, okay, it's 1 out of 3, but we also know that those witches, their only goal was to destroy him and was to lure him into a sense of being safe when he wasn't. So we know that that's coming. We then go back to Macbeth in the castle, and Macbeth in the castle, again, he's getting even more erratic if it's possible, and he's getting angry, and he does still keep sort of repeating to himself, but I'm fine because, you know, no man or woman can harm me. And he finds out that Lady Macbeth has died. All right, so all we hear, we don't see this happen. There's a lot of deaths that aren't shown on stage. We hear women screaming, and then we have a report, sort of someone come in and say to him, the Queen's dead. And this is, I would argue, some people say that the way he responds to this seems very unsympathetic. I would argue actually that it's his moment of anagnorisis. So if you're not clear on what that is, I will look more into that when we talk about, potentially when we talk about like more detailed tragic hero stuff. But ultimately, it's believed that a tragic hero has to have a moment of anagnorisis where they essentially realise, they have to realise that they are the reason for their own downfall. They have to realise and have a moment of essentially clarity. You could argue that Lady Macbeth's anagnorisis is when she says, who would have thought the old man to have so much blood in him? So it's the moment when they kind of take a step back and go, oh God, what have I done here? You know, this is pretty bad. And he finds out his wife is dead. And he sort of, basically, there's a line that's a little bit ambiguous, because he sort of says, well, she should have died tomorrow because then I've had more time to deal with it. Now, that bit on its own sounds quite unfeeling. But then he has this beautiful soliloquy where he talks about tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and how life sort of drags itself on and it's endless and it just keeps going. And it's essentially him acknowledging the pointlessness of life. And he says, you know, life is a tale told by an idiot. It's full of sound and fury signifying nothing. The idea that actually he's sort of suddenly realised, you could argue he's going, so I've done all this for what? Because it's over, out, brief candle, you know, a candle flickers and is fragile and is easily blown out. And he realises that now. Is this him going, I've done all this and now I've lost Lady Macbeth, and so what was the point of it all? But then again, he sort of goes straight back to really fighting and really being very aggressive and violent. So there's also that to bear in mind. The fact is, this soliloquy, I think, is one, if you were talking about Macbeth as a character, it's definitely an interesting one because it shows an ambiguity, and it's also very open to interpretation how you think he performs those lines and what you think Shakespeare was intending with those lines. My argument would be that's his moment of clarity, where I think even if it's just fleeting, he does take a step back and think, oh my goodness, like, what have I actually been doing here? Anyway, so she is dead, and he has had his moment where he sort of thinks about it, but he's also aware that he can't really, you know, do much about it at that moment because there's a hell of a lot of people on their way to kill him. So what he also finds out is that the trees look like they're moving towards him, and they sort of realise that it's Malcolm and his English army. And at this point he sort of goes, okay, those witches kind of screwed me over here, didn't they? But he's not, again, it's one of those moments where you think, okay, is this really relatable? Because if it were me, I'd think, right, those witches have stitched me up here. I'm going to be a bit suspicious about those other things he told me. But instead of doing that, he sort of goes, okay, so that was bad, and those witches weren't nice to tell me that. They weren't nice to tell me that if the woods move, you know, I'll be fine until the woods move, because now the woods have moved. Instead, he kind of goes, okay, but that's fine, because everyone, you know, everyone's born a woman. So, you know, what man is not born a woman? And he just immediately sort of latches onto the next thing that he thinks will keep him safe instead. Again, far too trusting. My argument comes back to, is ambition his fatal flaw, or is this very trusting, sort of easily manipulated part of his character more his fatal flaw? Because that seems to be what gets him into more trouble. Or just his need to hold on to the power he's got. Rather than ambition, he's not really being ambitious at this point. He's just trying to hold on to that power that he took originally. He's never really, from that moment, tried to get more power. All he's done from sort of getting the throne is just hold on to the power he's already got. I would argue that ambition isn't really his problem. Anyway, so he obviously he's getting even more angry now. He's getting even more erratic, more wound up. He's shouting at everybody left, right and centre. There are characters that I'm not going to mention for the sake of just the story today, just you getting from A to B, but we can go back and look in more detail at specific things if that is what is required. So we are now at the end of Act 5, Scene 5. And again, some of these scenes are really short. They're like that much in a book, not even a full page. And now we are back outside the castle again. So we're cross-cutting, if you will, between outside and inside the castle and different players. And we go to outside the castle, and this is where the battle really starts to commence. The English army have reached the castle, and Macbeth's army are kind of there. We learn also that a lot of his army now, it's depleted. A lot of people have abandoned him, and it's mentioned earlier on that really the people that have stayed are the people that are just too scared to go anywhere else. They're not there because they're loyal. They're there because they're scared of him. And that sort of ties in with the parallel that Malcolm has of people just loving him and wanting to be there to support him, and how Duncan was before that. So after that, we see the battle commence, and nothing massive happens here. It's just basically Macduff wanting to get into the castle to find Macbeth. So we kind of know that prophecy about, beware Macduff, we know why that's so poignant. Potentially Macbeth doesn't realise why that's quite so poignant yet. And we go back into the castle for Scene 7, and we're getting closer and closer now. So now that Macbeth's reliance on the Burnham Woods moving has kind of been shattered, he is now quite seamlessly moved on to really, really believing that he'll be fine because no man or woman born can harm him. And so he keeps repeating that. And he talks about how he's not going to be the Roman soldier and fall on his sword. And I didn't know this, but basically Roman soldiers back in the day, rather than be taken by the enemy, they would fall on their own swords. They would essentially commit suicide because it was seen as the honourable thing to do. And Macbeth's like, I ain't doing that. Like, I'm going out fighting. Give him his dues. He begins a warrior. He dies a warrior. He doesn't run away. And at this point, sort of Macduff comes running in just as Macbeth has kind of run off somewhere else, and we know that they're about to come head to head. So Scene 7 is kind of quite a quick scene that just shows these two characters getting closer and closer towards their moment. And then we get to the final scene of the play, and this is the scene where Macduff and Macbeth finally come face to face, okay? And there's a moment in it where, Macbeth says something along the lines of, like, leave it, mate, I've spilt enough of your family's blood, like, I don't want to spill more of it. Now, I think you could read that in a very goading way, in the sense that he's like pushing him almost, look, I've killed all your rest of your family, don't make me kill you as well. Or is it him having a moment of genuine, like, okay, I've killed a lot of people, Macduff, I really don't want to have to do this to you as well. Again, open to interpretation. That's why Shakespeare is so brilliant. It's not specified how he wants this performed. So Macduff's like, yeah, that's not going to work with me, mate. You are like so dead, it's unreal, because of all the reasons that we've talked about before. You've killed my family, you've terrorised Scotland, you murdered Duncan. You got to go, man. You got to go. And so they fight. Now, you don't actually, well, in most versions of this play, it's not actually written that you see him kill Macbeth. You kind of see them disappear off, and then Macduff kind of turns up in a little while later with his head. The fact is, by the end of this scene, Macbeth is dead, okay? And he is obviously killed by Macbeth. the big part of that is when Macbeth's like, look, you can do what you want, mate. No man or woman born can harm me. So, you know, I'm kind of safe. So you might as well just leave it now. God, greasy hair. And that's the moment when Macduff goes, aha, but I'm not from a woman born, because from my mother's womb I was untimely ripped. He was born by cesarean section. Bit of a loophole that Shakespeare's got there, because in theory, probably still a woman born. But we'll let him have it. He's Shakespeare, he can do what he wants. And so at that moment, Macbeth has his final, like, oh my God, they have completely stitched me up here, haven't they? And he realises that he was taken for a fool the whole time. Absolutely the whole time he was taken for a fool. And he's still been taken for a fool, you know. He's just let them lead him on all this way. There's not loads of time for him to kind of talk and muse on it, because he's pretty much then just chased out by Macbeth and he's about to die himself. But we know, the audience realise that, you know, the witches really did win here. The witches really did lead him to his destruction. They made him feel secure so that they could ultimately end him at the end. So that's that. And obviously him being told to beware Macduff also becomes obviously very true as well. So the final part of the final scene is Malcolm essentially giving a speech to everybody in the sort of the court about the fact that things are going to be okay again now. All right. And he sort of says, look, we're going to bring back all our friends that have had to flee from the evil tyranny of this butcher and his wife. We are going to do this. We're going to do this. And he sort of gives this really beautiful long, well, not that long, but this really beautiful sort of itemized list almost of all the things he's going to do to put things right. And if we compare that directly with the way Macbeth's been talking recently, he's so erratic, he's so violent, he's so angry. Malcolm is measured, he's balanced. Remember this focus on chaos and order, and this way that everyone was so worried about having things sort of disrupted and chaos reigning. He is like this sort of, he's quenching the fires that Macbeth created, you know. He's sort of putting them out and he's calming things down and he's bringing everything back to how it should be. And he, I think it's perfect to have him finish the play, because everything's been sort of rectified now. The rightful king is back in place. The really bad guy has been killed, because that's what has to happen, because God was wronged and the wrong king was in power, and that can't happen. So the wrong people have been punished. The right people are back. And the final image that we have of this play is Macduff standing in the background. And again, remember, not many stage directions often used, but this is very specific. He's standing in the background holding Macduff's head, Macbeth's head. And I always think that's such a clear visual reminder. This is a cautionary tale, isn't it? It's like, look, don't mess with the king, because look what happened to the guy that did. This butcher, this tyrant, this is the guy that did it, and look how it ends up for him. It's never going to end well for you, so don't do it. So we finish with Malcolm being basically put back on the throne as the rightful king, as it should have been all along. Macbeth and his wife have been killed or killed themselves, ended their lives horribly in one way or another, and, you know, will be punished for eternity, we assume. And I suppose it's a happy ending to a point. Because it's a tragedy, we have to have a high body count. There's a lot of death going on. There's more deaths than I've mentioned here, but we can go into that in more detail at a later date. So at this point, we've finished Macbeth, which is quite nice. We're done. And yeah, the makeup's insane today, not looking its best at all, but I just thought I'd do something fairly easy because I wanted to get through quite a long act. And we'll start with a different text next time, I think. But hopefully if you've watched the series of videos, hopefully you've kind of got a better idea of the story, you've got a better idea of key events and any detail we can go into in other ways. All right, but thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon.